The Story Girl, Chapter 26. Peter Makes an Impression. Peter's turn came next. He did not write his sermon out. That, he said, was too hard. Nor did he mean to take a text. "Why, who ever heard of a sermon without a text?" asked Felix blankly. "I'm going to take a subject instead of a text," said Peter loftily. "I ain't going to tie myself down to a text, and I'm going to have heads in it, 3 heads. You hadn't a single head in yours," he added to me. "Uncle Alec says that Uncle Edward says heads are beginning to go out of fashion," I said defiantly, all the more defiantly that I felt I should have had heads in my sermon. It would doubtless have made a much deeper impression. But the truth was, I had forgotten all about such things. "Well, I'm going to have them, and I don't care if they are unfashionable," said Peter. "They're good things. And Aunt Jane used to say if a man didn't have heads and stick to them, he'd go wandering all over the Bible and never get anywhere in particular." "What are you going to preach on?" asked Felix. "You'll find out next Sunday," said Peter significantly. The next Sunday was in October, and a lovely day it was, warm and bland as June. There was something in the fine, elusive air that recalled beautiful, forgotten things and suggested delicate future hopes. The woods had wrapped fine woven gossamers about them, and the westering hill was crimson and gold. We sat around the pulpit stone and waited for Peter and Sara Ray. It was the former's Sunday off, and had gone home the night before. But he assured us he would be back in time to preach his sermon. Presently he arrived and mounted the granite boulder as if to the manner born. He was dressed in his new suit, and I, perceiving this, felt that he had the advantage of me. When I preached, I had to wear my second-best suit, for it was one of Aunt Janet's laws that we should take our good suits off when we came home from church. There were, I saw, compensations for being a hired boy. Peter made quite a handsome little minister, in his navy-blue coat, white collar, and neatly bowed tie. His black eyes shone, and his black curls were brushed up in quite a ministerial pompadour, but threatened to tumble over at the top in graceless ringlets. It was decided that there was no use in waiting for Sara Ray, who might or might not come according to the humor in which her mother was. Therefore Peter proceeded with the service. He read the chapter and gave out the hymn with as much sang-froid as if he had been doing it all his life. Mr. Marwood himself could not have bettered the way in which Peter said, "We will sing the whole hymn, omitting the 4th stanza." That was a fine touch, which I had not thought of. I began to think that, after all, Peter might be a foeman worthy of my steel. When Peter was ready to begin, he thrust his hands into his pockets, and totally unorthodox as it was, then he plunged in without further ado, speaking in his ordinary conversational tone. Another unorthodox thing. There was no short-handed reporter present to take the sermon down, but if necessary I could preach it all verbatim, and so, I doubt not, could every one who heard it. It was not a forgettable kind of sermon. "Dearly beloved," said Peter, "my sermon is about the bad place. In short, about hell." An electric shock seemed to run through the audience. Everybody looked suddenly alert. Peter had in one sentence done what my whole sermon had failed to do. He had made an impression. "I shall divide my sermon into 3 heads," pursued Peter. "The first head is, what you must not do if you don't want to go to the bad place. The second head is, what the bad place is like, sensation in the audience. And the third head is, how to escape going there. Now, there's a great many things you must not do, and it's very important to know what they are. You ought not to lose no time in finding out. In the first place, you mustn't ever forget to mind what grown-ups tell you. That is, good grown-up people." "But how are you going to tell who are the good grown-up people?" asked Felix suddenly, forgetting that he was in church. "Oh, that is easy," said Peter. "You can always just feel who is good and who isn't. And you mustn't tell lies, and you mustn't murder anyone. You might be forgiven for telling lies, and if you was real sorry for them, but if you murdered anyone, it would be pretty hard to get forgiven. So you'd better be on the safe side, and you mustn't commit suicide, because if you did, you wouldn't have any chance of repenting it. And you mustn't forget to say your prayers, and you mustn't quarrel with your sister. At this point, Felicity gave Dan a significant poke with her elbow, and Dan was up in arms at once. "Don't you be preaching to me, Peter Craig," he cried out. "I won't stand it. I don't quarrel with my sister any oftener than she quarrels with me. You can just leave me alone." "Who's touching you?" demanded Peter. "I didn't mention no names. A minister can say anything he likes in the pulpit, as long as he doesn't mention any names, and nobody can answer back." "All right, but just you wait till tomorrow," growled Dan, subsiding reluctantly into silence under the reproachful looks of the girls. "You must not play any games on Sunday," went on Peter. "That is, any weekday games, or whisper in church, or laugh in church. I did that once, but I was awful sorry. And you mustn't take any notice of Paddy. I mean of the family cat at family prayers, not even if he climbs right up on your back. And you mustn't call names or make faces." "Amen," cried Felix, who had suffered many things because Felicity so often made faces at him. Peter stopped and glared at him over the edge of the pulpit stone. "You haven't any business to call out a thing like that right in the middle of my sermon," he said. "They did it in the Methodist church at Markdale," protested Felix, somewhat abashed. "I've heard them." "I know they do. That's the Methodist way, and it is all right for them. I haven't a word to say against Methodists. My Aunt Jane was one, and I might have been one myself, if I hadn't been so scared of the Judgment Day. But you ain't a Methodist. You're a Presbyterian, ain't you?" "Yes, of course. I was born that way." "Very well, then. You've got to do things that the Presbyterians do. Don't let me hear any more of your amens, and I'll amen you." "Oh, don't anybody interrupt again," implored the Story Girl. "It isn't fair. How can anyone preach a good sermon if he is always being interrupted? Nobody interrupt Beverly." "Beverly didn't get up there and pitch into us like that," muttered Dan. "You mustn't fight," resumed Peter undauntedly. "That is, you mustn't fight for the fun of fighting, nor out of a bad temper. You must not say bad words or swear. You mustn't get drunk, although, of course, you wouldn't be likely to do that before you grow up. And the girls never. There's probably a good many other things you mustn't do, but these I've named are most important. Of course, I'm not saying you'll go to the bad place for sure if you do them. I only say you're running a risk. The devil is looking out for the people who do these things, and he'll be more likely to get after them than to waste time over the people who don't do them. And that's all about the first head of my sermon." At this point Sara Ray arrived, somewhat out of breath. Peter looked at her reproachfully. "You've missed my whole first head, Sara," he said. "That isn't fair, when you're to be one of the judges. I think I ought to preach it over again for you." "That was really done once. I know a story about it," said the Story Girl. "Who's interrupting now?" said Dan slyly. "Never mind. Tell us the story," said the preacher himself, eagerly leaning over the pulpit. "It was Mr. Scott who did it," said the Story Girl. "He was preaching somewhere in Nova Scotia, and when he was more than halfway through his sermon, and you know sermons are very long in those days, a man walked in. Mr. Scott stopped until he had taken his seat. Then he said, 'My friend, you are very late for the service. I hope you won't be late for heaven. The congregation will excuse me if I recapitulate the sermon for our friend's behalf.' And then he just preached the sermon over again from the beginning. It is said that particular man was never known to be late for church again." "It served him right," said Dan. "But it was pretty hard lines on the rest of the congregation." "Now, let's be quiet so Peter can go on with his sermon," said Cecily. Peter squared his shoulders and took hold of the edge of the pulpit. Never a thump had he thumped, but I realized that his way of leaning forward and fixing this one or that one of his hearers with his eye was more effective. He proceeded to describe the bad place. Later on we discovered that he had found his material in an illustrated translation of Dante's Inferno, which had once been given to his Aunt Jane as a school prize. But at that time we supposed he must be drawing from a biblical source. Peter had been reading the Bible steadily ever since what we always referred to as the Judgment Sunday, and he was by now almost through it. None of the rest of us had ever read the entire Bible, and we thought Peter must have found his description of the world of the lost in some portion with which we were not acquainted. Therefore his descriptions carried all the weight of inspiration, and we sat appalled before his lurid phrases. He used his own words to clothe the ideas he had found, and the result was a force of simplicity that struck home to our imaginations. Suddenly Sara Ray sprang to her feet with a scream that changed into strangled laughter. We all, preacher included, looked at her aghast. Cecily and Felicity sprang up and caught hold of her. Sara Ray was really in a bad fit of hysterics, but we knew nothing of such a thing in our experiences, and we thought she had gone mad. She shrieked, cried, laughed, and flung herself about. "She's gone clean crazy," said Peter, coming down out of the pulpit with a very pale face. "You frightened her crazy with your dreadful sermon," said Felicity indignantly. She and Cecily each took Sara by an arm, and half leading, half carrying, got her out of the court of the orchard and up to the house. The rest of us looked to each other in terrified questioning. "You've made rather too much of an impression, Peter," said the Story Girl miserably. "She needn't have got so scared. If she'd only waited for the third head, I was going to show her how easy it was to get clear of going to the bad place and go to heaven instead. But you girls are always in such a hurry," said Peter bitterly. "Do you suppose they'll have to take her to the asylum?" said Dan in a whisper. "Hush! Here's your father," said Felix. Uncle Alec came striding down the orchard. We had never before seen Uncle Alec angry, but there was no doubt that he was very angry now. His blue eyes fairly blazed at us as he said, "What have you been doing, frightening Sara Ray in such a condition?" We were just having a sermon contest," explained the Story Girl tremulously, "and Peter preached about the bad place, and it frightened Sara. That's all, Uncle Alec." "All? I don't know what the result will be to that nervous, delicate child. She is shrieking in there, and nothing will quiet her. What do you mean by playing such a game on Sunday and making a jest of sacred things?" "No, not a word," for the Story Girl had attempted to speak. "You and Peter march off home, and the next time I find you up to such doings on Sunday or any other day, I'll give you cause to remember it to your last hour." The Story Girl and Peter went humbly home, and we went with them. "I can't understand grown-up people," said Felix despairingly. "When Uncle Edward preaches sermons, it was all right, but when we do it, it's making a jest of sacred things. And I heard Uncle Alec tell a story once about being nearly frightened to death when he was a little boy by a minister's preaching on the end of the world, and he said that was something like a sermon. You don't hear such sermons nowadays, but when Peter preaches just such a sermon, it's a very different story." "That's no wonder we can't understand the grown-up," said the Story Girl indignantly, "because we've never been grown-up ourselves. But they have been children, and I don't see why they can't understand us. Of course, perhaps, we shouldn't have had the contest on Sunday, but all the same, I think it's mean of Uncle Alec to be so cross. I do hope poor Sara won't have to be taken to the asylum." Poor Sara did not have to be. She was eventually quieted down, and was as well as usual the next day, and she humbly begged Peter's pardon for spoiling his sermon. Peter granted it rather grumpily, and I fear that he never really quite forgave Sara for her untimely outburst. Felix, too, felt resentment against her, because he had lost the chance of preaching his sermon. Of course, I know I wouldn't have got the prize, for I couldn't have made such an impression as Peter. He said to us mournfully, "But I'd like to have had a chance to show what I could do. That's what comes of having those crybaby girls mixed up in things." Cecily was just as scared as Sara Ray, but she'd more sense than to show it like that. "Well, Sara couldn't help it," said the Story Girl charitably, "but it does seem as if we'd had dreadful luck in everything we've tried lately. I thought of a new game this morning, but I'm almost afraid to mention it, for I suppose something dreadful will come of it, too." "Oh, tell us what it is," everybody entreated. "Well, it's a trial by ordeal. We're to see which of us can pass it. The ordeal is to eat one of the bitter apples in big mouthfuls without making a single face." Dan made a face to begin with. "I don't believe any of us can do that," he said. "You can't, if you take bites big enough to fill your mouth," giggled Felicity with cruelty and without provocation. "Well, maybe you could," retorted Dan sarcastically. "You'd be too afraid of spoiling your looks. You'd rather die than make a face. I suppose no matter what you ate." "Felicity makes enough faces when there's nothing to make faces at," said Felix, who had been grimaced at over the breakfast table that morning and hadn't liked it. "I think the bitter apples would be real good for Felix," said Felicity. "They say sour things make people thin." "Let's go and get the bitter apples," said Cecily hastily, seeing that Felix, Felicity, and Dan were on the verge of a quarrel more bitter than the apples. We went to the seedling tree and got an apple apiece. The game was that every one must take a bite in turn, chew it up, and swallow it without making a face. Peter again distinguished himself. He and he alone passed the ordeal, munching those dreadful mouthfuls without so much as a change of expression on his countenance, while the facial contortions the rest of us went through baffled description. In every subsequent trial it was the same. Peter never made a face, and no one else could help making them. It sent him up 50% in Felicity's estimation. "Peter is a real smart boy," she said. "It's such a pity he is a hired boy." But if we could not pass the ordeal, we got any amount of fun out of it, at least. Evening after evening the orchard re-echoed to our peals of laughter. "Bless the children," said Uncle Alec, as he carried the milk pails across the yard. "Nothing can quench their spirits for long." Chapter 27. The Ordeal of a Bitter Apple. I could never understand why Felix took Peter's success in the ordeal of bitter apples so much to heart. He had not felt very keenly over the matter of the sermons, and certainly the mere fact that Peter could eat sour apples without making a face did not cast any reflection on the honor or ability of the other competitors. But to Felix everything suddenly became flat slate and unprofitable, because Peter continued to hold the championship of bitter apples. It haunted him his every waking hour, and obsessed his nights. I heard him talking in his sleep about it. If anything could have made him thin, the way he worried over this matter would have done it. For myself, I cared not a groat. I had wished to be successful in the sermon contest, and felt sore whenever I thought of my failure. But I had no burning desire to eat sour apples without grimacing, and I did not sympathize over and above with my brother. When, however, he took to praying about it, I realized how deeply he felt on the subject, and hoped he would be successful. Felix prayed earnestly that he might be enabled to eat a bitter apple without making a face, and when he had prayed 3 nights after this manner, he contrived to eat a bitter apple without a grimace until he came to the last bite, which proved too much for him. But Felix was vastly encouraged. But this devoutly desired consumption did not come to pass. In spite of prayers and heroic attempts, Felix could never get beyond that last bite. Not even faith and works in combination could avail, For at a time he could not understand this, but he thought the mystery was solved when Cecily came to him one day and told him that Peter was praying against him. "He's praying that you'll never be able to eat a bitter apple without making a face," she said. "He told Felicity, and Felicity told me. She said she thought it was real cute of him. I think that it's a dreadful way to talk about praying, and I told her so. She wanted me to promise not to tell you, but I wouldn't promise, because I think it's fair for you to know what is going on." Felix was very indignant and aggrieved as well. "I don't see why God should answer Peter's prayers instead of mine," he said bitterly. "I've gone to church on Sunday all my life, and Peter never went till this summer. It isn't fair." "Oh, Felix, don't talk like that," said Cecily, shocked. "God must be fair. I'll tell you what I believe is the reason. Peter prays 3 times a day regular, in the morning and at dinner time and at night, and besides that, any time through the day when he happens to think of it. He just prays standing up. Did you ever hear of such going on?" "Well, he's got to stop praying against me anyhow," said Felix resolutely. "I won't put up with it, and I'll go and tell him so right off." Felix marched over to Uncle Roger's and was tailed after. We found Peter shelling beans in the granary and whistling cheerily, as with a conscience void of offense towards all men. "Look here, Peter," said Felix ominously. "They tell me that you've been praying right along that I couldn't eat a bitter apple. Now I'll tell you." "I never did," exclaimed Peter indignantly. "I never mentioned your name. I never prayed that you couldn't eat a bitter apple. I just prayed that I'd be the only one that could." "Well, that's the same thing," cried Felix. "You've just been praying for the opposite to me out of spite. And you've got to stop it, Peter Craig." "Well, I just guess I won't," said Peter angrily. "I've just as good a right to pray for what I want as you, Felix King, even if you was brought up in Toronto. I suppose you think a hired boy hasn't any business to pray for particular things, but I'll show you. I'll just pray for what I please, and I like to see you try and stop me." "You'll have to fight me if you keep on praying against me," said Felix. The girls gasped, but Dan and I were jubilant, snuffing battle afar off. "All right, I'm ready any time you mention," said Peter defiantly. "I can fight as well as pray." "Oh, don't fight," implored Cecily. "I think it would be dreadful. Surely you can arrange it some other way. Let's all give up the ordeal anyway. There isn't much fun in it, and then neither of you need pray about it." "I don't want to give up the ordeal," said Felix. "I won't." "Oh, well, surely you can settle it some way without fighting," persisted Cecily. "I'm not wanting to fight," said Peter. "It's Felix. If he don't interfere with my prayers, there's no need of fighting. But if he does, there's no other way to settle it." "But how will that be settled?" said Cecily. "Oh, whoever's licked will have to give in about the praying," said Peter. "That's fair enough. If I'm licked, I won't pray for that particular thing any more." "That's dreadful to fight about anything so religious as praying," said poor Cecily. "Why, they were always fighting about religion in old times," said Felix. "That's more religious anything was, the more fighting there was about it." "A fellow's got a right to pray as he pleases," said Peter, "and if anybody tries to stop him, he's bound to fight. Miss Morwood was Felix's Sunday school teacher, and he was very fond of her, but by that time Felix was quite reckless." "I don't care what she would say," he retorted. Felicity tried another tack. "You'll be sure to get whipped if you fight with Peter," she said. "You're too fat to fight." After that, no moral force on earth could have prevented Felix from fighting. He would have faced an army with banners. "You might settle it by drawing lots," said Cecily desperately. "Drawing lots is wickeder than fighting," said Dan. "It's a kind of gambling." "What would your Aunt Jane say if she knew you were going to fight?" Cecily demanded of Peter. "Don't you drag my Aunt Jane into this affair," said Peter darkly. You said you were going to be a Presbyterian, persisted Cecily. Good Presbyterians don't fight. Oh, don't they? I heard your Uncle Roger say that Presbyterians were the best for fighting in the world, or the worst. I forget which he said, but it means the same thing. Cecily had but one more shot in her locker. I thought you said your sermon, Peter, that people shouldn't fight. I said they oughtn't to fight for fun or for bad temper, retorted Peter. This is different. I know what I'm fighting for, but I can't think of the word. I guess you mean principle, I suggested. Yes, that's it, agreed Peter. It's all right to fight for principle. It's kind of like praying with your fists. Oh, can't you do something to prevent them from fighting? She pleaded to the Story Girl. It doesn't do to meddle in the affairs of this kind between boys, said the Story Girl sagely. I may be mistaken, but I do not believe the Story Girl wanted the fight to stop, and I am far from being sure that Felicity did either. It was ultimately arranged that the combat should take place in the fir wood behind Uncle Roger's granary. It was a nice, remote, bosky place where no prowling grown-up could be likely to intrude, and thither we all resorted at sunset. I hope Felix will beat, said the Story Girl to me, not only for the family honor, but because that was a mean prayer of Peter's. Do you think he will? I don't know, I confessed dubiously. Felix is too fat. He'll get out of breath in no time, and Peter is such a cool customer. He's a year older than Felix, but then Felix has had some practice. He was taught in Toronto how to fight, and this is Peter's first fight. Did you ever fight? Asked the Story Girl. Once, I said briefly, dreading the next question, which promptly came. Who beat? It is sometimes a bitter thing to tell the truth, especially to a young lady for whom you have a great admiration. I had a struggle with the temptation in which I frankly confess I might have been worsted had it not been for a saving and timely remembrance of a certain resolution made on the day preceding Judgment Sunday. The other fellow, I said, with reluctant honesty. Well, said the Story Girl, I think it doesn't matter whether you get whipped or not, so long as you fight a good square fight. Her potent voice made me feel that I was quite a hero after all, and the sting went out of my recollection of that old fight. When we arrived behind the granary, the others were all there. Cecily was very pale, and Felix and Peter were taking off their coats. There was a pure yellow sunset that evening, and the aisles of the fir were flooded with its radiance. A cool autumn wind was whistling among the dark boughs of scattering blood-red leaves from the maple at the end of the granary. Now, said Dan, I'll count, and when I say 3, you pitch in, and hammer each other until one of you has had enough. Cecily, keep quiet now. 1, 2, 3. Peter and Felix pitched in, with more zeal than discretion on both sides, and as a result Peter got what later developed into a black eye, and Felix's nose began bleeding. Cecily gave a shriek and ran out of the wood. We thought she had fled because she could not endure the sight of blood, and we were not sorry, for her manifest disapproval and anxiety were dampening the excitement of the occasion. Felix and Peter drew apart after the first onset and circled about one after another. Then, just as they had come to grips again, Uncle Alec walked around the corner of the granary with Cecily behind him. He was not angry. There was a quizzical look in his eye, but he took the combatants by their shirt collars and dragged them apart. This stops right here, boys, he said. You know I don't allow fighting. Oh, but Uncle Alec, it was this way, began Felix eagerly. Peter, no, I don't want to hear about it, said Uncle Alec sternly. I don't care what you were fighting about, but you must settle your quarrel in a different fashion. Remember my commands, Felix. Peter, Roger is looking for you to wash his buggy. Be off. Peter went off rather sullenly, and Felix, also sullenly, sat down and began to nurse his nose. He turned his back on Cecily. Cecily caught it after Uncle Alec had gone. Dan called her a telltale and a baby, and sneered at her until Cecily began to cry. I couldn't stand by and watch Felix and Peter pound each other all to pieces, she sobbed. They've been such friends, and it was dreadful to see them fighting. Uncle Roger would have let them fight it out, said the Story Girl discontentedly. Uncle Roger believes in boys fighting. He says it has harmless a way as any of working out original sin. Peter and Felix wouldn't have been any the worse friends after it. They'd have been better friends because the praying question would have been settled. And now it can't be, unless Felicity can coax Peter to give up praying against Felix. For once in her life, the Story Girl was not as tactful as her wont, or it is possible that she said it out of malice. At all events, Felicity resented the imputation that she had more influence with Peter than anyone else. I don't meddle with hired boys' prayers, she said haughtily. It was all nonsense fighting about such prayers anyhow, said Dan, who probably thought that since all chance of fight was over, he might as well avow his real sentiments as its volley. Just as much nonsense as praying about the bitter apples in the first place. Oh, Dan, don't you believe there is some good in praying? Said Cecily reproachfully. Yes, I believe there's some good in some kinds of praying, but not in that kind, said Dan sturdily. I don't believe God cares whether anybody can eat an apple without making a face or not. I don't believe it's right to talk to God if you were well acquainted with him, said Felicity, who felt that it was a good chance to snub Dan. There's something wrong somewhere, said Cecily perplexedly. We ought to pray for what we want. Oh, that I'm sure. And Peter wanted to be the only one who could pass the ordeal. It seems as if he must be right, and yet it doesn't seem so. I wish I could understand it. Peter's prayer was wrong because it was selfish prayer, I guess, said the Story Girl thoughtfully. Felix's prayer was all right because it wouldn't have hurt anyone else, but it was selfish of Peter to want to be the only one. We mustn't pray selfish prayers. Oh, I see through it now, said Cecily joyfully. Yes, but, said Dan triumphantly, if you believe God answers prayers, but particular things, it was Peter's prayer he answered. What do you make of that? Oh, said the Story Girl, shaking her head impatiently. That's no use of trying to make such things out. We only get more mixed up all the time. Let's leave it alone, and I'll tell you a story. Aunt Olivia had a letter today from a friend in Nova Scotia who lives in Shubenacadie. When I said I thought it a funny name, she told me to go and look in her scrapbook, and I would find a story about the origin of the name, and I did. Don't you want to hear it? Of course we did. We all sat down at the root of the fir. Felix, having finally squared matters with his nose, turned around and listened also. He would not look at Cecily, but every one else he had forgiven. The Story Girl leaned that brown head of hers against the fir trunk behind her and looked up at the apple-green sky through the dark boughs above us. She wore, I remember, a dress of warm crimson, and she had wound around her head a string of waxberries. That looked like a fillet of pearls. Her cheeks were still flushed with the excitement of the evening. In the dim light she was beautiful, with a wild, majestic loveliness, a compelling charm that would not be denied. Many, many moons ago, an Indian tribe lived on the banks of the river in Nova Scotia. One of the young braves was named Acadie. He was the tallest and bravest and handsomest young man in the tribe. Why is it they're always so handsome in stories? Asked Anne. Why are they never no stories about ugly people? Perhaps ugly people never have stories happen to them, suggested Felicity. I think they're just interesting as the handsome people, retorted Dan. Well, maybe they are in real life, said Cecily, but in stories it's just as easy to make them handsome as not. I like them best that way. I just love to read a story where a heroine is beautiful as a dream. Pretty people are always conceited, said Felix, who was getting tired of holding his tongue. The heroes in the stories are always nice, said Felicity, with apparent irreverence. They're always so tall and slender. Wouldn't it be awful funny if anyone wrote a story about a fat hero or about one who had too big a mouth? It doesn't matter what a man looks like, I said, feeling that Felix and Dan were catching it rather too hotly. He must be a good sort of chap and do heaps of things. That's all that's necessary. Do any of you happen to want to hear the rest of the story? Asked the Story Girl in an ominous, polite voice that recalled to us the sense of our bad manners. We apologized and promised to behave ourselves better. Acadie was all these things and that I have mentioned, and he was the best hunter in the tribe besides. Never an arrow of his that did not go straight to the mark. Many and many a snow-white moose he shot, and gave the beautiful skin to his sweetheart. Her name was Shoebean, and she was as lovely as the moon when it rises from the sea, and as pleasant as the summer twilight. Her eyes were dark and soft, her foot was as light as a breeze, and her voice sounded like a brook in the woods, or the wind that comes over the hills at night. She and Acadie were very much in love, and often they hunted together, for Shoebean was almost as skilful with her bow and arrow as Acadie himself. They had loved each other ever since they were small papooses, and they had vowed to love each other as long as the river ran. One twilight, when Acadie was out hunting in the woods, he shot a snow-white moose, and he took off his skin and wrapped it around him. Then he went on through the woods in the starlight. He felt so happy and light of heart that he sometimes frisked and capered about just like a real moose would do. And he was doing this when Shoebean, who was also hunting, saw him from afar and thought he was a real moose. She stole cautiously through the woods until she came to the brink of a little valley. Below her stood the snow-white moose. She drew the arrow to her eye. Alas! She knew the art only too well, and took a careful aim. The next moment Acadie fell dead with her arrow in his heart. The Story Girl paused, a dramatic pause. It was quite dark in the fir wood. We could see her face and the eyes but dimly through the gloom. A silvery moon was looking down on us over the granary. The stars twinkled through the soft waving boughs. Beyond the wood we caught a glimpse of moonlight world laying in the sharp forest of the October evening. The sky above it was chill and ethereal and mystical. But all about us were shadows, and the weird little tale, told in a voice fraught with mystery and pathos, had peopled them for us with furtive folk in belt and wampum and dark-tressed Indian maidens. "What did Shoebean do when she found out she had killed Acadie?" asked Felicity. "She died of a broken heart before the spring, and she and Acadie were buried side by side on the bank of the river which has ever since borne their names, the river Shoebean-Acadie," said the Story Girl. The sharp wind blew around the granary, and Cecily shivered. We heard Aunt Janet's voice calling, "Children, children!" shaking off the spell of the fir and the moonlight and the romantic tale. We scrambled to our feet and went homeward. "I kind of wish I'd been born an Indian," said Dan. "It must have been a jolly life, nothing to do but hunt and fight." "It wouldn't be so nice if they caught you and tortured you at the stake," said Felicity. "No," said Dan reluctantly. "I suppose there'd be some drawbacks to everything, even to being an Indian." "Isn't it cold?" said Cecily as she shivered. "It will soon be winter. I wish summer could last forever. Felicity likes the winter, and so does the Story Girl, but I don't. It always seems so long till spring." "Never mind. We've had a splendid summer," I said, to comfort some childish sorrow that breathed in her plaintive voice. Truly we had had a delectable summer, and having it, it was ours forever. Nevertheless, we all felt a little of the sadness of the waning year. There was a distinct weight on our spirits until Felicity took us into the pantry and stayed us with apple tart and comforted us with cream. Then we brightened up, and it was really a very decent world after all.